Several years ago, Scott Chamberlain, who was the pastor of a ministry in Los Angeles, invited me to walk the streets with him. I first met Scott when he was student body president at Olivet Nazarene University. And he invited me as a college student to come to the university to lead a few classes and some sessions on compassion. He left the university and went to Los Angeles, and for several years, his church was Lafayette Park in LA. It was a church without walls. There were no places to meet. He just gathered whoever he could in the park. And week after week, he would respond to them as best he could with what he had. And gradually they began to form a nucleus and came together in the Central City mission there in Los Angeles. If you've been to LA in that part of town, you know what the city has done. Through zoning regulations, they've placed several large missions in one part of the city to keep the homeless people from being in other parts of the city. It's a bizarre experience to be in that part. Union Mission, Los Angeles Mission, and Scottsdale. These are huge enterprises, thousands of people, all congregating in one part of LA in these gospel missions. And they come out of the missions during the daytime, and they're all over the streets, laying around. When you walk that part of the city, you've got to step over homeless people, people scrounging for food, trying to sleep on the streets. They're all there. The city has done this deliberately in order to keep all the undesirable people in one part of town. And there is where Scott set up the ministry, which is still there. Jerry is still there, I presume, is it? Central. Pardon me? About 300 every Sunday morning in that part of town. But Scott said, I want to take you for a walk. And we began to walk that part of Los Angeles. And he said, see that vacant lot over there? That's where Phineas Bresee, the founder of the first Church of the Nazarene, in 1895 in Los Angeles, big city back then, about 25,000 people. We talk about urban ministry. That's what LA was in 1895. He said that's where Phineas Bresee began his ministry and constructed a building they called the Glory Barn, a 24/7 operation. That's where it all got started. I think Bresee would have found our definition of compassionate ministries very curious. You see, then they didn't make a separation between evangelism and compassion. It was all one. That separation occurred later. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. I won't get to everything I have to say, but I want to try to hit some of these. Wesley would not have understood what we are talking about when we talk about compassionate ministries. Bresee wouldn't have understood why you organize compassionate ministries. That's what the church did. I mean, that was the church. Why would you organize a mission when this was the mission of the church? The Glory Barn was a 24/7 operation with people being fed and preached. And this afternoon, Ron Benefield gave us an overview of what went on in those early days. Worth coming to the conference just to hear that overview in Sam Vassel's session. Takes us back to our roots. Our Nazarene family started in what is now the urban core of Los Angeles. Back then, a small, in fact, all of our cities, none of our cities, well, perhaps here in the Northeast, Philadelphia and New York were great metropolitan centers, but most of our cities were nothing like that. Bresee and his followers organized what we might call mission outposts in other cities of the West, including Portland, Seattle, and Spokane, and eventually he would move towards the major cities of the Midwest and Northeast. As these mergers that eventually brought about the 1908 Nazarene marriage in Pilot Point, Texas, the movement had established churches in Denver, Chicago, and soon after in Nashville, Kansas City, Washington, D.C., Portland, Pittsburgh, and you could go across the country. Before World War II, most of the flagship Nazarene churches in the United States and Canada were in what we now know as the urban core of what the Census Bureau in the United States now calls metropolitan areas. But all of that changed following World War II. By the way, one of our challenges in urban ministry is to decide what we mean by an urban area. A lot of confusion about that. If you want to know what the United States government did, go to the Census Bureau's pages and look up the definitions of the cities. A metropolitan area includes lots of different kinds of residential areas, including suburban and even some rural areas in these metropolitan areas. The fourth largest city in terms of city boundaries in the U.S. is Houston, behind New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, then Houston. But if you describe the cities by metropolitan areas, Baltimore and Washington is number 4. In the government's mind, Baltimore and Washington is one metropolitan area because it is an area integrated by commerce and communication and transportation. So the cities have been redefined for government purposes, and the way we develop public policy to serve people in these metropolitan areas, that has a profound effect on what we do as a church. People are interconnected in metropolitan areas in ways that they really don't understand. I can remember one attempt in the Washington area, we had this idea of coordinating the work of the church just as the government coordinates the work beyond city boundaries. We couldn't get the suburban and the inner city churches to even come together to meet. There was a sense we have nothing to do with one another. I think the challenge for the future in urban ministries is to find a way of reconciling all of these divergent views of the city, bring them together so we can work together in urban ministry. And now, of course, the United States gains about 1% a year, which is about 3 million people. A city the size of Chicago is being added to our population every year. And a lot of these people are in what's now being called micro-metropolitan areas. I mean, these are gated communities way out there, and I don't know how you ever get a church started in one of those places. They'll zone out the churches. We're going to have to find new ways of reaching the new areas within our metropolitan areas. Well, let me come back to the story here. Before World War II, most of the Nazarene flagship churches were in what we call now the urban core of our metropolitan areas. That changed, and the change was often described as white flight. And it resulted from some major social forces at work at mid-century. And there were, I think, generally 3 major things occurring in our society at that time that affected the life of our church. One was the post-World War II phenomena of suburbs. Suburbs were the result of public policies and Federal Housing Administration providing low-interest loans to veterans, among other things. So we got this explosion of suburban communities moving out from the urban core. There was what Nicholas Lehman describes in his book, The Promised Land, the Great Black Migration. Over 5 million black people moved out of the Deep South into the northern cities at mid-century. And then in 1965, this very significant immigration legislation, where the federal government decided no longer to favor immigrants from Western Europe, Ireland and Italy and so forth, and open the immigration into the United States to all of the countries of the world. And immediately you begin to see a changing face of America, and it changed the face of the church as immigrants began to come from all over the world, the United States and Canada. There was another phenomena that occurred in the early part of the 20th century, which was a result of the conflict between fundamentalism and so-called liberalism. And theologians, historians of this period talk about the Great Reversal. Timothy Smith coined that term. David Moberg wrote a book by that title, The Great Reversal. When the church evangelical church moved from its social consciousness to a kind of individualism. And no longer was there this sense of responsibility for the care of society. All that mattered was getting an individual to heaven. Because there was this developing sense that society was on its way to hell. Can't do anything about that. After World War I, the Great Depression, people had just given up on reforming society. Let's just get people to heaven, forget about everything else. So all of these things are coming together in a way that changed the faith. I think you can put bookends in the Church of the Nazarene at least around 1925 and 1975. I don't have time to go into all of that. But 1925, it was like the lights went off in some way. At the general level, at the district level, we had commissions for orphanages and social work. It was a part of the fabric of who we were. It all changed in 1925, almost overnight. And for the next 50 years, we went through a period of growth, but it was also a period of retrenchment from our origins in the Wesley tradition with John Wesley in the 18th century evangelical revival, the 19th century revivalism and social reform, the formative period of the Church of the Nazarene. I could sort of divide this in my own mind in three sections. The Church of the Nazarene up until 1925, the formative period. From 1925 to 1975, the formal period when our structures got formalized. And from 75 on, I'm not sure what to call it, maybe the present future. And I'm going to end by suggesting some of the challenges that I think we have for the future. And I haven't taken a text. I'm preaching to a text, actually. I should tell you what it is. Where I hope to end up is Luke 6:36. So if you want to read something else and listen to me, turn in your Bible to Luke 6:36, and I'll catch up with you in a moment. One of the influential books that was prophetic in describing what was about to happen was Gibson Winter's book, The Suburban Captivity of the Churches. He was a sociologist at the University of Chicago. Dal Mucci, you knew him. And he predicted what would happen if you get a family-centered ministry versus a parish-centered ministry. And when the families begin to relocate, the churches migrate. And that's exactly what happened. He was describing this not in a pejorative way, but just saying you can tell what's going to happen if your churches are structured around this model. And so, indeed, what Gibson Winter described in that book occurred. Now, I come along in my own experience, and I may testify here a little bit. Some of you know I had a church in the African American community for 25 years. Started out as an all-white church and ended up I was the only white person there. Oh, excuse me. Turn that off so I can blow my nose. But in 25 years, the folks in that church never thought what I did was preaching. So I would bring in people like Larry Lott once in a while just so they could hear some preaching. I tried that style, and any of you ever see that movie Stir Crazy, where they're trying to teach this guy to walk? What's the actor? What was his name? Yeah, Richard Pryor was trying to teach trying to teach him to walk. And I can tell you, folks, the brothers tried to teach me to walk. No, they said, just be yourself, that works better. So, I just did what I could. And thank the Lord, Brother Phillips came along. I remember that day, Oliver. Oliver's another great preacher. He is going to be, he's been asked to preach at M7. There will be about 5,000 folks there. and he's been given the topic, Compassion and Justice. Will you come and will you pray for Oliver as he preaches at M7? He has developed a real following around the country and lots of invitations to preach, and he has a message that God is blessing in all of our churches. Thank the Lord for Dr. Oliver Phillips and all of these done in this conference. Let's give him a hand, shall we, for what he's done? During the 60s, my formative years of ministry, I was aware of a call to urban ministry, which was synonymous with what we now call compassionate ministries. We had nothing like Nazarene Compassionate Ministries back then. And I had no idea about what I was about to get myself into. Being there at Washington First Church, as Newell said, and resigning that and going down the street a couple of miles to what was in the inner northwest ghetto of Washington, D.C. The burned out buildings from the 68 riots were still there. And I began working with Jubilee Housing to create low-income housing cooperatives, and that was our ministry day by day. I worked 2 years in that neighborhood without telling anybody I was a minister, because churches didn't have a very good reputation. I mean, you could stand on the corner and hear every theology, every ideology in the world being preached, and nothing changed. And I wasn't sure that I wanted to be in that neighborhood pronouncing and preaching unless we were doing something worthwhile. And you can imagine what some of the reaction of some of the people were when they found out who I was. Why didn't you tell us you were a preacher? Because you would have changed up on me, wouldn't you? Well, there were a few folks, and some are here, who I'm trying to describe this movement from mavericks to mainstream, because I think we're now mainstreaming this. But back in those days, there were a group of mavericks. And I'm just trying to give you, I was asked this evening, I was given this topic by Oliver, so it's your fault, Oliver. Last night, Cheryl Sanders had holiness, and tomorrow morning, Gustavo Crocker is going to have hope, and he gave me history. So what are you going to do with history? Here it is. There wasn't one person, well, my mother, and maybe my wife, who thought I was in my right mind and doing a good thing when we decided to resign that church and begin a ministry a couple of miles in the inner city. Not that I needed that kind of affirmation. It would have been good. But it didn't. You can't imagine, some of you younger folks here can't imagine how things have changed since 1975. We've moved from having to explain why in the world would you ever want to do urban ministry in the urban core of the city to having to explain now why you're not doing it in many instances, because now it's become the right thing to do. We know better now than we seemed to have back then. There were a number of others. The most out-of-the-box character in the early 70s was Paul Moore. Now, Paul's still in New York City, I understand. Some of you remember the Time magazine where Paul Moore was featured as the Jesus movement guy? I should have worn my jeans tonight. I got a couple of compliments this week for wearing a pair of jeans around, you know. You know, Paul Moore came out with jeans and a clerical collar, a rock band in Central Park, and it was in Time magazine. I mean, this was, you know, off the charts. Nobody could believe that you could be a preacher in blue jeans. And then from our tradition to put on a clerical collar with those blue jeans and then organize a rock band and go hold services in Central Park. He was doing that. You know that. I came up a few times when I was in Washington those years to join him in the Manhattan Project, it was called. He had this rock band, and they were worshiping in the basement of a Methodist church. the Manhattan Project. I mean, you just couldn't imagine what anybody would do. I mean, why he would do anything like that. And then the opportunity to purchase the Lambs, that historic theater guild in Times Square. And what really brought it all together was a partnership with Paul Moore and the Lambs and Earl Lee on the West Coast in Pasadena. At that time, Earl Lee was the bigger-than-life minister of all of the United States. People were standing in line. It was a tourist attraction to go to Pasadena first. It really was. Earl Lee was this mystical kind of and had gathered this congregation. And at that point, Pasadena First Church had become the flagship church of the California West Coast. And they partnered with Paul Moore, and all of a sudden it became legitimate. If Earl Lee at Pasadena First would partner with Paul Moore in Times Square and begin sending some money and boosting that thing, then it must be okay. And I think we were off and running. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how much Paul Moore's life influenced mine, but I think he probably gave me some courage to put on my blue jeans and go incognito almost down into the city and take it on and begin to discover, what life is like in that part of the world. It wasn't long before a young man, Mike Christensen, joined up with Paul Moore, and he goes out to San Francisco. Now, at the same time, there were some other folks around who were a little hard to understand and figure out. One was Esther Sanger up in the Boston area. I went up to see Esther. She's this little old lady. She still couldn't see above the steering wheel even when she was sitting on a pillow. Little tiny thing. She was a nurse. She herself was an orphan, taken in by some Nazarene folks in Quincy. She turned her home into a warehouse of food supplies and took them out literally onto the streets of Boston and was feeding folks in the Boston area on the street. She organized then a home for the Quincy Crisis Center for pregnant young women to help them have a place to live and bear their children and go on and care for them. Esther Sanger was just one of those strangest people. If you were around her, the passion and the dedication of this tiny little woman had a real rough life, but something got a hold of her and she set the pace for that Boston area. Well, those were the 60s. Anybody else, I may ask for this, who else do you know of that sort of surfaced in the early 70s? Pardon me? George Hunter? Who's George Hunter? Pardon me? In Venice Beach. All right, I don't know him. I do know Monroe and Joanne Ballard. I was on a World Vision committee one time, and Joanne Ballard was sitting across, and I was looking at this lady over there, and we began to listen to one another, and I was so surprised to discover she was a Nazarene. Where have you been, Joanne? And we were in that meeting together, and we got together around the edges and began to talk, and it was in the early 70s. Now, you got to know that Monroe and Joanne Ballard, before they had an organized program, they opened their home to take kids in as foster parents. Would that be a good description of what you're doing? Foster parents. When I went down there, they put two houses together, or the driveway in between, and I slept in one of those rooms where the foster, where the kids would stay. Before they ever had a program, they were just taking in kids, giving them a place to live, and getting them off to college. And then in 72, they began the Neighborhood Christian Center. You all need to go there. I was there 2 weeks ago. They have just constructed a $5 million facility within walking distance of 5 public schools in Memphis. I mean, it is an amazing operation. Read her book. Not only have they done that, but she's been recruiting and training preachers. I don't know what her day job is. I mean, she got the Neighborhood Christian Center going, and then on the side, she's got this passion for recruiting and training preachers. And we have, for a city of its size, more African American preachers and churches in the Church of Nazarene than any other city in the country because of Monroe and Joanne Ballard. Thank the Lord for what they've done. I don't know who gave you permission, Joanne, and Monroe, but Monroe was teaching school through the years while Joanne was doing this stuff, and then a few years ago he retired, and now they're in there doing that together. There were a number of other mavericks. C.R. Smith. Any of you folks remember C.R. Smith? He was the furniture salesman, led to the Lord, a white guy, led to the Lord by, no, not yet. Yeah, no, I'm not there yet. I'll get there in a minute. But Charles Johnson in Meridian, Mississippi. And C.R. Smith just gives up his furniture company and starts this youth center in Orlando, Florida. And before long, this thing is thousands of kids. His forte was boxing. These boxing clubs, and had kids coming in there. And C.R. Smith, and then Jerry Appleby comes along and starts working on that. Well, by the 70s, a new form of ministry was taking shape. The new wineskins. What we discovered was you can't go back into the cities with the same model that we had prior with these flagship churches, typical cookie-cutter congregations. You had to have a new structure. And so it was the nonprofit organizations, these 501c3s that we call compassionate ministry centers, we began to call them in the 80s and the 90s. But they just began to spring up all over the country. I wrote this little book, Compassion Evangelism, and at that time, 10 years ago, there were 86. Now there are near 200. These compassionate ministry. These are the new forms of ministry. You had to create a structure that you could use to raise money and organize programs. So our churches began to organize these parallel organizations. Now, some of them are more attached to churches than others. Some of them are an arm's length relationship. But they are new forms of ministry that are trying to find ways of getting back to the needs of people in the urban core of our cities. About 200 of them now. Well, the need at this moment is to move from mavericks to mainstream. That's why, Oliver, I'm excited about this conference, because what you're trying to do here by getting these DSs in a room. Now, I can tell you the DSs have not come kicking and screaming. I remember the first DS I saw or talked to who had an understanding of sociology was Ken Mills. Ken, you were the DS up in New England, and I remember in those early days some conversations with you, and I understood right away there's a new DS on the horizon here. Men and women who understand culture and understand society and understand their role as mission directors of creating a new kind of ministry and supporting that. It's one thing to have a bunch of mavericks like Joanne Ballard and Paul Moore, and maybe I'm in that group. Nobody sent us out. Nobody gave us a budget. There was no money in this. You had to scrape it up however you could. There was no endorsement, really. I mean, there was as one guy said, I have got the foggiest idea what you're doing, but I believe in you. And, you take that as far as you can go, and I appreciated the family that was willing to believe in me even when they didn't understand me. But at some point, this thing has got to be mainstream. It's got to be institutionalized. It's got to be a part of our district programs. It's got to be a part of our general program. It's got to be what we do, not just what a few mavericks do. We've all got to be in this together. Our challenge now is to move from mavericks to mainstream. So this is a defining characteristic of our Nazarene family, ministering in the urban core, an inclusive church that includes all of the nations that have come to the United States, so they're all a part of this Nazarene family and committed to serving the poorest of the poor. Well, I'm going to maybe work toward my text here with some suggestions for the future. Now you can put that up, Debbie. Lessons from the Mavericks. Now, every one of you here would have your own list. But I'd just like to leave you with some things I think I've learned and that I would recommend that you perhaps pay attention to. Number one, love the city. Mayor Good, I walked around Philadelphia this afternoon. This is a great city. I would love to live here. I mean, this is a wonderful place. All of the variety, the culture, everything that's here. I don't think you're going to be effective in urban ministry if you come into it kicking and screaming. I don't think God calls you to do something you don't want to do. I mean, if that's the feeling you've got, just go off and do something else. I used to say, bless God, if you were really called, you'd be down here. And I came to the place where I said, no, don't do this unless, if you can do anything else and get to heaven, then go ahead and do that. Because God's only going to use you if this is where you really want to be. Love the city. The first author that I thought developed the theology of that was Harvey Cox of The Secular City. Now, Harvey Cox had to change a lot of what he said because the city is probably more religious than secular, and he's had to change some of his things in his subsequent books. But what he did in that book, The Secular City, is describe why people come to the city. In fact, people are coming to the city to escape small towns and the scrutiny and the in-your-face stuff of small-town America. They're coming to the city because they can choose their communities. Neighborhood is a choice in the city. Most of our churches now are started by demographics, not geography, because people choose. People have the freedom to choose when they come to the city. I love that about the city. I can choose where the restaurant I want to go to. I can choose the school I want to go. I can choose, all of these choices in the city. It's a wonderful thing. we got to love the city and to celebrate it. I'd say number two, find a niche. I once in a while would take a walk around the Community of Hope there in Washington, D.C., and think of the amazing variety of ministries. There was a Catholic, looked like a cathedral to me, St. Augustine's, that happened to be the largest African-American Roman Catholic parish in the city, just around the corner. In fact, I taught the priest of St. Augustine's how to baptize people by immersion. They had a great gospel choir. It sounded like a Baptist church, Mayor. But he didn't know how to baptize people. He said, what do you do? I said, well, you get a handkerchief and you put over the nose and swimming pool or wherever you want, and you put them down like this. And he said, I'll give it a try. They were around the corner. There were storefront Pentecostal missions. There was a gospel mission. There were historic black churches that began before the Civil War. There were, the Moonies were there. Incredible variety of religions and styles. There's no one way to do urban ministry. You got to find your niche. Find out what works for you and do it. It's not right or wrong. There are just all sorts of things going on in the city. And I've had lots of folks through the years come and say, well, what do you think of this plan? What do you think of that plan? I say, any plan will work if you work it. Just find your niche in the city, discover what it is, and stay with it. Learn the culture. One of the most interesting books ever written out of Washington, D.C. culture was a book called Tally's Corner by Elliot LeBeau. If you want to, still, it's a classic. If you ever see a copy of it on the used books, pick that up, Tally's Corner. I think I know the corner. But this guy got in the inside of street people. And he was a cultural anthropologist at Howard University. And out of that study, he wrote Tally's Corner. I would suggest that you immerse yourself in cultural anthropology. So the sociologists typically, by discipline, look for social problems to solve. The anthropologists, by discipline, just observe. And their discipline is just to see it as it is and interpret it. And they're not trying to fix a problem. They're just trying to see what is there. So pay attention to the culture. Learn the culture. Learn the languages, the nuances, the dialects of the city. Have a plan. I wrote out my plan in those early years. I went off on vacation and took a little typewriter, before computers, of course, and wrote this 20-page paper that I called The Alternate Church. And I was still first years then. I was so afraid that my DS would eventually get this thing and what he might say that I put it in a brown paper wrapper. I carried around me. I had a man in the congregation who was an attorney, and we used to go down to the National Gallery of Art in Washington and get off in a corner where I was sure it wasn't bugged and talk about this subversive plan. Now, I wasn't paranoid. I knew people who had been excommunicated for doing no more than what I was proposing that I might do with my life. And so, one day, I decided to, I just had to do it. Put in the address of my district superintendent, put it in the mail, and wait for the phone to ring. Gary Carnahan, are you here? There he is. It was his dad who was the DS. And I just was waiting for Roy Carnahan to call, and sure enough, he did. And Roy was on the other end. He said, Tom, this is good stuff. I want you to come and present this to a group of pastors. I mean, I couldn't imagine it, that he actually would affirm that. Lots of stories about Roy Carnahan, but it would never have happened. Roy told me one time as a DS, he said, we're all accountable. For some of you, you pastors do DSs, and he said, just don't tell me what I don't need to know. So most of what we did never showed up on a pastor's report, and he was cool with that because he knew that in that kind of ministry, you had to be willing to do things that were out of the box, and and more stuff failed than succeeded. You just know that's going to be the way it is, but you stay with it because you believe you're called to do what God wants you to do, regardless of what happens. This is where I have to go. This is what I have to do. God's called me to be here. But have a plan. Interestingly enough, that paper was later published word for word under another title called A Church in Mission in a book that Neil Wiseman published, To the City with Love. And can you imagine? From feeling like you were carrying around the subversive document that was going to get you excommunicated to having that crazy thing published. But have a plan. Write it down. Lots of folks have come to me through the years and said, I'd like to do this. I said, you don't know what it is unless you can put it in writing. Put it down so someone else can read it, and someone else will know what it is that you're called to, and that will help you attract a group. No matter what you want to do, you can't do it alone. I used to have people come in the congregation, God's called me to this. And I said, go find 3 or 4 others who believe this is God's called, and we'll talk. But, everybody, all these crazy ideas. I want to do this. Go find a group of people that will surround you with prayer and bless this, and then we'll recognize it as God's call, but not until you can attract a group with your plan. And then prepare for change. In that street, and that Belmont Street, which was the inner northwest ghetto in Washington, D.C., about 2 miles north of the White House, the building, Bob Lanier, you've moved the church now. That building that they couldn't give away when we started. Literally, property owners were walking away from buildings and hoping that someone like us would come along and take them so they could cut their losses. That building just recently sold for $3 million. The last time I drove down the street, they completely gutted it. They're putting in luxury condos. The only building of affordable housing in that neighborhood right now is a building which is owned by a low-income tenant cooperative that we created back 20 years ago. Those are the only people who will be able to stay in that neighborhood. It's completely changed. Now, I appreciate what Cheryl Sanders had to say last night about her church. I know where that Third Street Church of God is. They're going to stay regardless of the escalating values. Somebody needs to stay, but a lot of things are changing. If you're going to direct your ministry to the poor, you're going to be transient. Because the poor are generally going to have the lead. Our cities are becoming very European. London and Paris and Berlin, the poor are all around the edges. Is that right, Gustavo? The center core cities are extremely wealthy. And it's a public policy issue. Our cities are becoming much like that. There is a donut of sorts, the ring around the city. And so the poor are always transient. They're always going to have the least desirable, and they're going to have to move. And if you're going to have a ministry committed to work among the poor, then you're going to be transient. But the city's made up of a lot more people than just the poor. We have a ministry to the whole of the urban core and the metropolitan area and all of the diversity and the income differences of the city. The church is to be there for everybody. So when we're talking about urban ministry, we've got to be careful that we just don't categorize it as one thing. It's lots of things in lots of different places with lots of different people. That's the challenge of urban ministry. Well, let me conclude with what I think is the present-future challenge. For all that we have gained since 1975, we still haven't caught up to our forebears, for whom compassion was not a means to an end, but an end in itself. Amen. For our forebears, and this is where you come to Luke 6:36. Compassion describes who you are, not what you do. Amen. Jesus in Luke 6:36, and this is Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew it is, be perfect or be holy as your Father in heaven is perfect. In Luke, it's be compassionate. Now your version may say merciful. Elios is the Greek word there. It's often translated compassionate. The word of the Lord is, be compassionate as your Father in heaven is compassionate. This is who you are to be. And out of your being, this is what you will do. You don't do compassion, you are compassion. It's how you express your faith. The forebears of our movement, John Wesley and Phineas, they didn't do this in order to build up their membership or to win converts. They did it because this is how they express their faith and their relationship to Christ as disciples. Now, I happen to think when you do it that way, you will do better at winning people to your cause. In fact, if you do it the other way, if you do it as a means to an end, people will see through that. The only reason you're doing this is in order to make your point and get you to join my cause. That won't sell this day and age. People will see through that. It's got to be given away because Jesus said to his disciples, be compassionate as your Father is compassionate. It's who we are and not necessarily what we do. Well, to move from an end, from a means to an end in itself. The other movement is from philanthropy to justice. If I had time, I could break it down in terms of the formative period of the Church of the Nazarene. Our forebears were not only about serving the poor, but they recognized that you can't change individuals without taking on society. Now, whatever you think about prohibition, they were radical prohibitionists. They knew that you weren't going to solve the problem of alcohol abuse just by multiplying converts. You had to change some laws. They were also radical suffragettes. They were advocating for women's rights. If you read the early documents of the Church of the Nazarene, you'll find articles on women's rights that are as radical as anything you read today. We were always out in the forefront of advocating not only for the right of women to preach and to be ordained in the Church of the Nazarene, but to have equal wages for equal work and to be recognized for all they do. These were our forebears. They were about social justice as well as and more moving beyond philanthropy. I think in this day and age, where we need to move, again, is away from compassion as a means to an end, as an end in itself, and to alongside of our philanthropic activities to join God's mission of justice in the world. You know, in many of your ministries, you begin with relief, feeding the hungry and the poor, and then you decide, I got to find out why these people are not having enough food to eat. There's something going on back here. So the inevitable progression of compassionate ministry is from relief to development. You get in development because you've seen the folks falling off the cliff. Somebody's got to put a fence across the cliff to keep them from falling over, and so that's development. The same thing is true with philanthropy and justice. It's not enough just for the White House to have an office of compassionate conservative, or whatever it is. You know, and in some ways, the government is out ahead of us because the government has given us the agenda of responding to human need. I'm not sure our churches are ready to walk through that door yet. I pray that we will do more than we're doing. This isn't to advocate that you take government money. You may or you may not, for a variety of reasons. But we need to be in the public square, doing God's mission in the world, which isn't simply giving things away to those who are hungry and homeless, but it is doing justice and righteousness. In fact, the words are synonymous in the Hebrew language, justice and righteousness. I've been thinking, what if John Wesley were alive today? You know, what John Wesley said, the world is my parish. What in his world parish would John Wesley pick up on today? Totally different world. He couldn't have imagined from 18th century England to 21st century world what this world is like. I don't know. But I think, from what I know about what he did in his day, he said he felt closer to New Testament Christianity when he spent his nights at the Foundry. The Foundry was a facility for homeless, destitute people in the center of London. Whenever he went to London, that's where he wanted to stay because he said, I felt closer to New Testament Christianity there than any place else. I think John Wesley today would take on the issue of global poverty. 1 billion people in the world survive on less than $1 a day. And if you just keep it to the Nazarene family, the Church of the Nazarene is growing today most rapidly among desperately poor people. 100,000 Nazarenes, the largest group of Nazarenes outside the United States, are just offshore in Haiti, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. Our most rapid growth today is in sub-Saharan Africa. Many of our brothers and sisters in our own family are dying of starvation. Now, what are we going to do about that? Let alone the 1 billion people in the world who survive on less than $1 a day. You know, I'm kind of tired of Bono being the only one on this justice thing, you know? I'm glad, I love you too, you know? And I'm getting in some church these days that have bands that sound like you too. I can get really blessed about that, you know? But Bono, you know, shows up on the covers of magazines speaking truth to power in the White House. You know, where's the faith community? Why aren't we there? I mean, go for it, Bono, but I want to be there too. I want to be a part of a church that's dealing with the big issues. This is God's world. This is God's family. This is God's mission in the world. That's what I want to be a part of. Well, thank you, my family, for being my family. This is as close as it gets to heaven as you're ever going to find in the Church of Nazarene. This group right here. It doesn't get better than this. And I am so privileged to be here through all of these years and to just be included and have your hearing in this faith community, brothers and sisters in the Lord. I wish there's so much more than me. Roger and Marlene Bowman going down to Meridian, Mississippi 60 years ago, 50 years ago. Can you imagine what they went through to be a part of this faith community in Meridian, Mississippi? What was the year, Roger? 1960. Roger's walked the streets of Washington with me. We got some stories there to tell too. But thank you, Roger, Marlena, Monroe, Joanne Ballard, Dal Mucci, you pace setters, you mavericks, you folks who have gone out there and done it. May your tribe increase, and may all those who follow call you blessed. Amen.